Imagine a person who transforms from a writer of stories and novels into a murderous criminal who spills blood, and then shamelessly publishes a novel containing details of the crime he committed in real life, details that only the criminal knows. A person like this undoubtedly has reached the utmost level of arrogance and narcissism. This novel was a challenge to the police and investigators to catch the criminal, with its incredibly strange and astonishing events. Make sure to follow it until the end. One day in December 2001, in an area located in eastern Poland, there were 3 fishermen fishing on the bank of a river. Suddenly, these fishermen saw something floating on the water. At first, they thought it was just a piece of wood or a tree trunk. However, as they approached it, the first thing they noticed was long hair that appeared to be human. Quickly, they realized that what was in front of them was not a tree trunk but the body of a human floating on the water. The 3 fishermen immediately cooperated to pull this person out of the water. Shortly afterward, they realized that this man had passed away. They immediately contacted the police and informed them of the situation. The police arrived, and the first thing the investigators noticed was that the body of this deceased person was tied with a rope. The rope was bound behind the person's back, and it was also connected or extended to their neck. This meant that any movement of the hands or any attempt to loosen the rope from behind would tighten it further around the neck. The police knew that the scene before them was undoubtedly a crime scene. The problem was that finding a body in the river in this manner, which had clearly erased all possible forensic evidence, left little hope of obtaining any fingerprints, DNA, or similar traces. Most likely, this was the killer's intention when throwing the body into the river. After examination by specialists and doctors, the report revealed that the victim had severe wounds and bruises on his body. Additionally, his stomach and intestines were completely empty, indicating that he had been tortured and deprived of food for several days before their death. Furthermore, his lungs were filled with water, indicating that he had been thrown into the river while still alive. As previously mentioned, he was restrained with a rope in a way that tightened around his neck whenever he attempted to resist or free his hands, ultimately choking his further. It appears that the victim remained in that state in the river until they drowned and their breath was cut off. For the police, it was evident that this crime was personal, as the killer harbored a deep grudge against the victim. After conducting further searches in their missing persons database, the police finally identified the victim. The victim's name was Darius, a man whose identity was now known to the authorities. Darius, a man in his 30s, worked as a manager in an advertising company. He had been missing for about a month before his body was found in the river. The investigators began their investigation and conducted interviews with Darius's family, friends, and acquaintances. However, all these investigations led to no result. According to people's testimonies, Darius was an ordinary man leading a peaceful life. He had no problems, enemies, criminal history, or questionable relationships. The police found themselves at a standstill, as every path they pursued in the investigation reached a dead end. They remained in this state for 6 months without making any progress in the case. Eventually, the case was transferred to the Unsolved Cases file, meaning it would no longer be actively investigated due to a lack of sufficient evidence. The case remained stagnant without any new leads. However, the Polish police have a routine procedure for reviewing unsolved cases periodically. This review process does not necessarily mean reopening or reinvestigating the case, but rather assigning a new investigator to review the case files and assess any potential new angles or evidence, and he sees that the original investigators may have forgotten or overlooked something that could lead to solving this case. In 2003, 2 years after the crime occurred, the case file fell into the hands of an investigator named Jacek Fruński. Jacek had prior knowledge of the case as it had gained notoriety throughout Poland. He had a strong and intense desire to solve it or uncover something new about it. Jacek began going through the case files, searching among the documents. During this search, he noticed something important that seemed to have been overlooked by the original investigators. It was related to a testimony provided by Darius's mother, the victim's mother. Darius's mother worked as an accountant in the same advertising company that her son owned and managed. During her interview with the investigators, she mentioned receiving a call from an unknown person on November 13, 2000, which was the last day her son was seen. At 9:30 in the morning of that day, the company's office received a call from a stranger who was looking for Darius. This person claimed to have an urgent project and needed to print 3 large advertising billboards. However, when Darius's mother tried to gather more information from the caller, he refused to provide any additional details and insisted on speaking directly with Darius about the project. However, the mother did not think much about it and simply explained to the man that her son was currently out of the office and would not be returning for a while. Without much thought, she gave the unknown man Darius's mobile phone number so that he could contact him directly. After the unidentified man took her son's number, he ended the call without revealing any information about himself. Hours later, Darius returned to the office, and his mother told him about the strange call from someone inquiring about him. Darius confirmed that he had indeed received a call and had arranged to meet the person in the afternoon. This was the last conversation between Darius and his mother before he completely disappeared. When the investigators traced these calls made for the company's office and Darius's mobile phone, they found they discovered that the 2 calls were made from a public phone, which was located on the same street where the advertising company's building was situated. This meant that the unknown person who made the calls was very close to the office, likely observing the place. Of course, the investigators considered the caller a prime suspect in the case. However, since the public phone could be used by anyone, it didn't provide them with any specific leads. They considered it a dead end. But now, let's return to investigator Yatsik, who was reviewing the case files. When he saw these events, he noticed a detail that the original investigators had overlooked. According to these events, Darius had a mobile phone that was never found. His phone was not present at the crime scene, in Darius's car, or in his office. It was nowhere to be found. This indicated that he had the phone in his possession when he disappeared. Most likely, the original investigators assumed that the phone belonged to Darius, and they speculated that it might have been lost in the river or disposed of by the killer. However, the investigator Yatsik made an assumption that the killer could have taken the phone and kept it in his possession. If Yatsik could track down this phone, he might be able to trace the killer as well. He began attempting to track it down, and luck was on his side when he discovered that Darius's wife had kept the phone purchase invoice, which served as proof of ownership. On this invoice, the investigator obtained the IMEI number, a unique identifier that distinguishes each phone from others. With this number, they could track the phone through telecommunications companies and determine if it was still in use or not. Fortunately, the investigator Yatsik received a positive result from the telecommunications companies. The phone was still in use, despite the crime having occurred more than 2 years ago. He managed to trace the phone's current owner and discovered that it had changed hands among 4 individuals over the past 2 years. Yatsik tracked down each owner one by one until he finally reached the source. He reached the first person who had used the phone after the crime was committed. This person told the investigator that he had purchased the phone from an online website. When Yatsik asked him about the timing of the phone purchase, he discovered that this person had bought it just 3 days after the crime had occurred. This indicates that the person who posted the phone for sale on the website was most likely the killer. The investigator accessed the website and went to the advertisement for selling the phone. This person who posted the phone for sale on the website was likely the killer, so the detective opened the website and went to the phone sales advertisement. He saw that the phone was listed for around $100. The individual who posted the phone for sale used the username Crispy7. When the investigator opened this user's profile, he reached the details of the account and learned that the real owner of the account was named Kristen. The police obtained details and identity information about Kristen from their database. They discovered that Kristen was a man in his 30s and also a writer of detective stories and novels. Detective Yatsik was thrilled that they finally had a strong suspect in the case. He delved deep into the details of this person's life and decided to acquire his latest novel. The novel he started reading was a crime novel called Amok. As Detective Yatsik began reading the novel, he felt like he was reading the memoirs of a killer rather than a work of fiction. The violent and sadistic manner in which Kristen described the events of the crime and the murders made the detective feel like he was reading about real-life experiences, things the author had actually tried. The graphic violence in the novel was written in an exceptionally savage and sadistic manner. Can you imagine? The main character in the novel was named Chris, which meant the madman. The main character in the novel is a killer named Christian Bala. This character, Chris, is portrayed as a superhuman figure who is not bound by any laws, be they human or natural. The 9th chapter of the novel describes the details of a murder of a young girl named Mary. Mary was Chris's lover in the novel, but she betrayed him, so he captured her, tied her hands behind her back with ropes, and then tied the rope around her neck. He did it the same way Darius was tied up, and then Chris tortured his treacherous lover and stabbed her to death with a knife. Afterwards, he sold the murder weapon, the knife, as a key piece of evidence in the crime, on a website for selling used items. As the detective read these details in the novel, he felt a strange resemblance between some of the details in the book and the details of Darius's murder, especially those that were not publicly disclosed by the police. For example, the way Darius was tied up with ropes and how the rope did not reach from his hands to his neck. The detective was 99% certain that there was a connection, was believed that Chris was the killer. The police wanted to summon Christian for questioning, but they discovered that he had left Poland immediately after the crime in 2001. Detective Yatek knew that he didn't have sufficient evidence to initiate an investigation or an international pursuit. The evidence they had was circumstantial, and the problem was that they didn't know the motive. They were unaware of the reason behind the crime, right? The evidence led them to Christian, but what was the motive? Why did Christian kill Darius? According to their investigations and interviews with Darius's family and friends, there was no apparent connection between the two. These two individuals had no relationship or communication between them, and based on their analysis of the crime and the signs of torture on Darius's body, they were almost certain that it was a personal crime. They believed that the killer held a grudge against Darius. The question here is why Christian Bala could be harboring a grudge against Darius when there was no apparent connection between them. Yatsik wanted to investigate and conduct interviews with people close to Christian Bala and his family, but he sensed that it might lead to backfire. It was possible that these individuals close to Christian would inform him that the police and investigators were tracking him, prompting him to stay out of the country and never return to Poland. Therefore, Yatsik decided not to interrogate any relatives or family members of Christian Bala and instead chose to revisit the novel Amok in the hope of finding something or a reason that would explain why Christian committed this crime. And indeed, Yatsik's intuition was correct. The reason was present in the novel itself. The entire novel revolved around this very reason. Despite Yatsik continuing to read and reread the novel multiple times, he couldn't uncover this reason. Although the information was always in front of him, Yatsik couldn't infer the reason because he didn't know the specific details of Christian Bala's life. It was difficult for him to deduce this reason even though it was right in front of him. Even you, despite mentioning it earlier, I don't think most of you knew exactly what it was. Neither you nor Detective Yatsik would know this reason until later, and the important thing is that the investigators had nothing else to go on except waiting and hoping that Christian Bala would return to Poland someday. In 2005, at one of Poland's airports, when a staff member was checking passports to ensure the person's identity, the system flagged one of these passports as wanted, Holder was of course Christine. Bala, the person the police had issued a warrant for Christian, was detained by airport security. After that, the police arrived and took him into custody formally. 5 years had passed since Darius' murder. Jacek and the accompanying investigators immediately began interrogating Christian Bala. He remained calm in a chilling manner throughout the questioning, never showing any signs of nervousness. He answered all their questions calmly and intelligently, providing no openings for them to catch him off guard. He denied every accusation they made against him. The investigators started to feel that their conversation with him was futile. Amid their frustration, one of the investigators asked him a question. "Did you commit the crime by yourself, or were you assisting someone else?" The investigator didn't expect anything other than Christian's denial. However, it seemed that this question stirred something in Christian. Perhaps it wounded his pride or made him feel belittled, as if the investigator regarded him as a mere accomplice. At that moment, Christian Bala fell silent, and then he calmly replied, "No, I didn't assist anyone. I executed the entire crime from beginning to end by myself." Investigators were stunned by his response. They had not expected such a provocative and trivial question to provoke him to this extent. This criminal was like a proud craftsman, unwilling to give credit to anyone other than himself. However, it seemed that he had forgotten that he was in an interrogation room in front of the investigators. Naturally, they were shocked that he confessed so easily, but suddenly Christian began behaving strangely. He started glancing around the room, looking left and right. His face displayed signs of shock, and then he began clutching his clothes and moving violently, as if he were suffocating or being pressed upon. He started gasping and panting as if in a state of terror, all while in the midst of this peculiar episode. He then started screaming at the investigators, demanding that they bring him a doctor. After realizing the condition of Christian, the investigators realized that they were dealing with a mentally ill individual with an extremely narcissistic personality disorder. Christian portrayed himself as the main character in the events, considering himself above the law and everyone else. He was mocking the investigators and treating the situation as if it were a novel he was writing. He truly saw himself as the smartest, strongest, and most dominant person in the room. Once the investigators became aware of Christian's true state, they understood that the investigation would be challenging. Dealing with a narcissistic personality could be difficult due to the nature of the disorder and the individual's refusal to accept existing facts. Any progress made in the investigation could be undermined due to Christian's unpredictable behavior and lack of credibility. It may be necessary for the investigators to work with experts in psychology or seek additional resources to deal with this complex psychological case. Obtaining concrete confessions or accurate answers from Christian may prove challenging given his personality disorder and unexpected behavior. However, the investigators should continue gathering evidence and interrogating other witnesses who may be connected to the crime. Further investigations may reveal new information or crucial evidence that helps determine the truth behind Darius' murder and identify the person responsible. Here, the investigators, led by Jacek, realized that they had no choice but to build a strong case against Christian in court. Jacek began investigating and interrogating people close to Christian, including his family and friends. Previously, he was concerned that they might inform Christian about the police pursuing him, causing him to flee Poland and not return. However, now that they had him in custody, Jacek was able to conduct thorough interrogations. Through these investigations, Jacek started to learn more about Christian's personality and his past through the accounts of those around him. He discovered that Christian was known for his intelligence and strong personality, but he was also notorious for being arrogant, narcissistic, deceitful, and manipulative. He would tell stories and legends about himself that made him appear as the greatest and smartest person in the world. Jacek also discovered that Christian had relationships with women. His confident personality made him appear very attractive to many of them, starting from high school days and continuing through university. We can consider him to be playing. In 1995, when he was 23 years old, He met a girl named Stasia, and as usual, he managed to charm her with his apparent intelligence, confidence, and external appearance. Shortly thereafter, he married Stasia, who only discovered his hidden true nature after marriage. Despite having a child together, the tension between them escalated rapidly, and their marriage continued to deteriorate day by day. Kristen would constantly shout at her, abuse her, and even physically harm her. His narcissistic nature was in control. If he couldn't assert his dominance through words, he would do so through force and violence. This is where we begin to understand the nature of his violent criminal behavior. During this time, Kristen would frequently cheat on his wife, and the problem was that he would boast about it. He didn't try to hide it or keep it a secret. He would always tell his wife that when confronted with these matters, he would do as he pleased and that she was obligated to obey him. He considered her duty to be confined to staying at home and raising their child. Imagine the extent to which this person saw himself. During this period, Kristen was struggling in life. He went through a phase of focusing on academics, but then dropped out and turned to business. However, he failed in every field he entered. One might ask whether Kristen was truly intelligent or simply saw himself as intelligent due to his narcissistic nature. Most likely, the latter option is true. Nevertheless, Kristen continued to struggle and fail in every field he entered. Despite his failures, his wife reached a point where she could no longer tolerate the situation and she obtained a divorce through a court order, leaving him to his miserable life. However, Kristen felt that the divorce was a blow to his pride and ego, and he became even more obsessed with his ex-wife than before. It was like a child who wants a toy even more when it's taken away from their hand. His narcissism led him to question how this worthless woman could leave him, as if he should be the one making such decisions. He saw her as his possession, and it was not her right to act on her own or be with someone other than him. This insane narcissist began to stalk his ex-wife, monitoring her every move. Sometimes, he would even intercept her path and threaten her with violence, declaring that he would kill any man who approached her. In that year, which was the year 2000, Stasia met a new man who entered her life. Yes, as most of you might expect, this man was Darius. Detective Yatsik, after uncovering all these facts, had a clear picture in front of him. He was able to deduce that when Kristen learned about the relationship between her ex-wife and Darius, he decided to carry out his threat and kill Darius. The reason was jealousy, the same reason that existed in the novel. The difference was that in the novel, Chris killed his unfaithful lover, while in reality, Chris killed his ex-wife's lover. Here, Yatsik understood why the killer held a grudge against Darius. As we mentioned earlier, Darius was tortured and starved for several days before being thrown alive into the river after being bound with ropes. This clearly indicated Kristen's deep resentment towards Darius and his crime. After Bala was arrested and his story and the story of his book were published, all the media and press outlets became interested and covered the case extensively, even beyond Poland. European and even American media began to cover the story. The headline was very captivating: a killer using the details of his crime to write a novel called Amok, which became wildly popular. It became one of the best-selling novels in Poland and all of Europe. The shock came when the court decided not to use this novel as evidence in Bala's trial. The prosecutor realized that the novel would not help prove the charges against him because, in the end, it was considered a work of fiction, not a documentation of real events. The similarities between the novel and Darius's murder were not confessions from Bala regarding the crime. Contrary to expectations, Bala wanted the court to attempt to use his novel against him. He wanted to say to the media, "Look at the absurd court using a work of fiction as evidence in a murder case." He wanted to use this as a means of defending himself and diverting attention from his narcissistic criminal actions. However, the court and the prosecutor surprised him by not using his novel against him in the trial. Even in one of the sessions, Bala himself attempted to introduce his novel into the courtroom and argued that it should be used as evidence against him. However, the judge simply replied to him, saying, "We are not discussing your novel, and no one is accusing you based on what you have written. We are here to talk about your crime, not your novel." This made Kristen extremely angry. He realized that his main defense strategy had collapsed. It was evident that he was tense and nervous from the early sessions of the trial. His calm and confident demeanor disappeared in an instant when he realized that the charges were stacking up against him without him having any ability to defend himself. The evidence against him was abundant. One of the first pieces of evidence was Darius's phone account, which was offered for sale online. It was proven to be Kristen's account. This was one of the dumbest things he did. Instead of disposing of the phone, he decided to sell it on the internet. The phone was the first piece of evidence against him. The second piece of evidence was the public telephone card that Kristen used. Public telephones were used with cards, and if you recall, there was a call from an unknown person to Darius's advertising office. After Mrs. Darius answered the call, the same unknown person took Darius's phone number and called him again from the same public telephone. All these calls were made using the same card. Although the police did not obtain this card and could not definitively prove that Kristen was the owner, they could still see the calls made with this card through the telecommunications company. The third piece of evidence was the testimony of his ex-wife and her description of the abusive treatment she endured from him, followed by his obsession with her and his relentless pursuit even after their divorce. She also mentioned his explicit threats to kill any man who will enter her life. She made it clear to the court that she had been in a relationship with Darius before he disappeared and the murder was uncovered. However, Kristen continued to deny her statements throughout the trial, repeatedly claiming that he did not know Darius and had no contact with him. This forms the fourth piece of evidence. As for the items found by the police during the search of his parents' house, this constitutes the fifth piece of evidence. Bala, before leaving Poland, was living in his parents' house, so the police decided to search the house in search of any traces he left behind. Of course, 5 years had passed since the crime and they did not expect to find anything useful. However, when they entered the house and searched it, they found a collection of belongings left by Christian. Among these belongings, they found a note containing details about Darius's company, the advertising and marketing company. They also found another note that included details about the places Darius visited and the people he met before his disappearance. They also discovered some photographs, messages, and gifts that indicated a close relationship between Christian and Darius. These pieces of evidence were used as part of the case against Bala as they demonstrated a clear connection between him and the committed crime. They also found a pen belonging to the same company with their logo on it. On top of all that, they discovered a business card belonging to Darius among Kristen belongings. During the trial, Kristen insisted that he had never met Darius, had no communication with him, and had never even heard his name before. However, the presence of all these items and belongings associated with Darius and his company shattered this claim and exposed his lie before the court. The prosecution was able to demonstrate the direct connection between Kristen and Darius through the presence of these items, undermining Kristen's denial and revealing his deceit in front of the court. Why such foolishness? Why would he keep belongings related to his victim after the crime? This is known in criminal psychology as crime trophies or crime mementos. The criminal feels a sense of accomplishment in successfully carrying out the crime and wants to keep a souvenir or memento that reminds him of his achievement. This reflects a different kind of narcissism and arrogance. These belongings served as the fourth piece of evidence that shattered his claim and exposed his blatant lies before the court. The fifth piece of evidence was the comments written by Kristen on the internet regarding a famous crime show that aired on television in Poland. This program covered the case from its inception in 2001, and the host of the show was trying to assist the police by raising awareness about the case among the public. The program had a website where they would receive comments about this crime throughout the past years. This, in itself, is peculiar, but what is even more peculiar is that these comments came from various parts of the world, especially from Asia and America. Despite the program's popularity being limited to Poland, the international engagement with the case through these comments is quite unusual. The court and the judge did not require any additional evidence to convict him of the crime. The evidence they possessed was more than sufficient. The court and the judge ruled that Christian was guilty of the crime and the killer. However, the sentence he received was indeed peculiar. They sentenced him to 25 years, which seemed unusual considering that one would expect a murderer to receive a harsher punishment. This is due to their specific laws and regulations in Poland. Upon further research, I discovered that it is extremely rare for them to impose a life sentence in Poland. They may reserve such a sentence for serial killers or heinous criminals who have killed numerous people. However, for cases involving abduction, torture, and murder of a single individual, a 25-year sentence is considered sufficient. It is true that according to the sentence he received, Christian is supposed to be released from prison after 10 years around the year 2032 when he is about 60 years old. Upon his release he would have access to his funds and profits awaiting him in the bank from the sales of his novel, which gained popularity due to the crime he committed. However, it is important to note that he continues to deny his involvement in the crime and claims that the court and the police fabricated a fictional narrative to incriminate him. And that is the end of the story. If you enjoy this type of content, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more, and don't forget to like to show your support.